Today's episode of Henry Wilson and the Civil War features my full interview with Elizabeth Leonard, a professor emerita of history at Colby College. Professor Leonard is the author of Benjamin Franklin Butler, A Noisy, Fearless Life. It's a fascinating biography of a man that had such an incredible impact on the Civil War and Reconstruction. Butler and Wilson had lives that crossed paths at many points, and they had many similarities in their politics, careers, and lives. So I feel learning about Butler's life reflects powerfully on Wilson and his legacy. After you listen to the interview, I encourage you to check out a copy of Professor Leonard's book. It is a really fascinating portrait of Butler and is full of some quirks and unknown details about this period. Thank you to Professor Leonard for taking the time to speak with me, and I hope you enjoy the interview.
So I'm Elizabeth Leonard, and I'm the author of a new biography of Benjamin Franklin Butler. The title of the book is Benjamin Franklin Butler, A Noisy, Fearless Life. And this is a much overdue, I think, revisitation of Butler's life and career. I am retired now, but I'm the Gibson Professor of History Emerita from Colby College, which is where Benjamin Butler went to school, and was a graduate in 1838 when the college was still known as Waterville College.
Yeah, and throughout reading the book, I was kind of amazed by a lot of the similarities that Butler and Wilson had, both in their lives, in their political upbringing, and their evolution of slavery, and just their involvement in the Civil War. But before we kind of jump into Butler, I was interested in just how you came across researching Butler and how you got interested in him as a subject. Of course, you both have that Colby connection.
Right.
So if you could talk about that and kind of what was your process of writing the book and kind of your timeline of research to getting it completed?
Yeah. Well, as a Civil War historian by trade, I encountered Butler many, many times because he just pops up. I have often said I think of him as being like Forrest Gump. He just keeps popping up everywhere in the 19th century and throughout the Civil War, of course. So I bumped into him on a regular basis. And then, of course, we had the Colby Connection. And I was being pushed a little bit by colleagues at Colby, particularly because there was a collection of his materials in our special collections department, to consider writing about him. But I had not yet really moved in that direction until at the time that Colby had its bicentennial celebration. They took a huge portrait that Butler had brought to the college himself and hung it back up in our alumni center and asked me to write the legend to go next to the portrait. And doing that required me to do some research. And then I got some encouragement from some other historians saying, Joshua Chamberlain from Bowdoin College has all this attention. Why not Butler? And so I just sort of inched my way in that direction. And the more I got to know him, the more interesting I found him. And I was particularly struck when I read an article by my predecessor at Colby that he wrote in 1964, so for the centennial celebration, about Butler. And I read that article and I thought, wow, it's a shame he never went on to write more about Butler, because he had a very interesting take on Butler. And so part of what pushed me forward, a big part, is the feeling that I wanted to complete the work that my colleague was not able to do. He retired and now he's gone, sadly. And so I wanted to do that. And the process was, a lot of trips to the Library of Congress and other repositories around the country where Butler papers are. There's a lot of Butler material out there. There's a lot of published material. There's his autobiography. There's a lot of unpublished material. The Library of Congress has an enormous collection of his stuff, and it's just going back and back and back to it, and getting to know him better and getting to know which stories are important, and also grappling with the whole issue of how Butler has been remembered or not remembered or misremembered, and trying to unpack some of those stories about him and see how true they were, and so on. So, and then the last piece I will say is that I had written the manuscript, and then the process is you send it off to the publisher, and they send it out to experts, and the experts comment on what you've said and make suggestions. And in the process, before I went back to revising it, COVID struck, and George Floyd was murdered. And certain things happened in our culture that I think actually, while I was frustrated with the delay in the book coming out, initially, I was grateful for them because they helped me to have a different perspective on his story based on some of the things that we as a nation have been going through ourselves so recently.
Yeah, certainly. And I felt that way with Wilson as well, kind of beginning that research and then getting drawn into the Black Lives Matter movement and just the way that the continuing legacy of that era follows through today. And I was kind of struck by, as a side note, to the introduction of your book where you talk about imagining Butler having a conversation with Ibram X. Kendi and just kind of the where we've come as a nation and where we still have to go is fascinating to think about when talking about Civil War and current day civil rights issues and race relations. But diving into Butler's life, could you tell me a little bit about Butler's upbringing before he got into politics, kind of up through his time becoming a lawyer?
Yeah, he was born in New Hampshire to a mother who had 3 stepdaughters and 2 other children. So he was the 6th child. And by the time he was born, his father had already died. So his mother was saddled with managing this large brood by herself with a limited amount of skill, a limited number of skills that she could deploy, and not a lot of support, family support. So they were pretty poor. But she had great aspirations for her son, Benjamin, and seemingly recognized early on that he was the one to send off to higher education, if at all possible, which proved to be true. His brother was a bit of a ne'er-do-well, and maybe she knew that early on. But anyway, she took the family to Lowell, Massachusetts, which was a booming industrial city or town that became a city, Spindle City. And she became a boarding house keeper. So he then, the next phase of his life, he got some of his education at Exeter. Then he went to Lowell High School. Then he went on to Colby. But a lot of his life education was in the boarding houses with those Lowell mill girls and their struggles with the mill owners and the town and so on. So he had a great book learning. You know, he had good book learning, and he also had very significant life learning that I think planted, plus the personal experience of his family, planted seeds of democratic, small d, thinking, and this vision of himself as being someone who would always fight for the underdog, because he himself was an underdog. And I think when he said later in his life, "I've always been with the underdog," he was telling the truth. That was his vision of the people he wanted to fight for. He didn't always have the same idea of who the underdogs were, but that changed over time and grew and expanded. But yeah, he was very much in a allegiance with people who were struggling.
And before Butler actually jumps into the political arena, it seems like there's not a lot of record on what his political views are. He gets educated in law. And one of the things that I found interesting was his legal defense of the mill girls in his early days as a lawyer. So if you want to briefly talk about that.
Yeah, well, he was very I mean, those were the people that sat around the table at the boarding house where his mother was a boarding house keeper, and he cared deeply about the way that the um, owners of the mills were treating these young women. When Lowell was founded as a company town for the early textile industry, there was a very idyllic vision of how industry in America would be different from industry in the UK, in Britain, for example. And it would be moral and upstanding, and there would be education, and everybody would be treated well, and everybody would go to church, and so on. And the mill owners would treat their workers well, and so on. And it did manage to be that way for a few years. But by the time Butler was in Lowell and becoming a lawyer, the situation in the mills had changed a lot, and he was hearing constantly about the struggles of these workers in the face of the speed ups and wage cuts and so on of their employers, and he was committed. And I think that we see him throughout his life being very comfortable with dealing with women's issues, what we might call women's issues today, and having strong women and supporting strong women around him. And I think that's from those Lowell Mill girls, but also from his mother and her strength. I mean, he always said that, she was the most important person in his life. And watching her struggle, I think, gave him a perspective on, how to orient his life and his talents.
Yeah, and these issues of women's rights will continue to pop up throughout his career, and even in his kind of later days in Congress and then as governor of Massachusetts. But Butler serves, like I said, as a lawyer for a little bit of time, and then he jumps into politics. So if you wanted to, if you could briefly kind of talk about how he jumped into politics and what some of his views were. One of the early kind of events of his political career was the Democratic Free Soil Coalition in the Massachusetts legislature. So if you want to kind of talk about his early political career, especially kind of through that lens.
Yeah. He, well, it was very common for particularly lawyers to also be involved in politics, as it is today. I mean, it seems very common. So it wasn't a strange thing that he would get involved in politics. The source of his early affiliation with the Democratic Party is not entirely clear, but it does seem that his father was probably a Democrat. He spoke about his his grandmother being a Democrat, again with a small d, but having these democratic ideals that he felt very strongly about himself. And he kind of identified as a Jacksonian or Jeffersonian Democrat, and got into politics through the Democratic Party in Massachusetts, which was not a huge force, and was always sort of scrapping to gain power. And he was certainly ambitious as well, but he nevertheless picked issues that would advance the rights of workers, the rights of immigrants, and so on, sort of bread and butter Democratic Party issues of his day, although he was not unwilling to form allegiances in order to undermine the power of parties that he felt were not, serving those interests. Like he really didn't he didn't like the Whigs. So anything to undermine the Whigs would be good in his mind. But, he was not early on a free soiler himself. He was certainly not dedicated to any issue relating to slavery early on. Was not part of his life experience. And but he was interested in the 10-hour workday. He was concerned about slavery, in quotation marks, as the way slavery functioned within the mills, the working man's slavery. He was not as connected to or aware of or interested in even chattel slavery in the South until he encountered it directly.
And I think that another similarity between Butler and Wilson is their connection with political parties, but their willingness to break from parties and support principle over everything else. And I think their tendency just to support practical politics.
Right.
And as Wilson biographer Ernest McKay put it, Wilson was kind of a practical radical. And I think that Butler can be put in that same camp as well. But one of the most interesting party events in Butler's life, I think, was the Cincinnati Convention in 1860 and Butler's decision to stay a Democrat. But kind of, I was very intrigued by his viewpoint of, if this party can't even stay together, then the country is going to fall apart very soon. In that sense
You
of,
mean that Charleston, not Cincinnati, is 56? You mean this 1860 convention where he votes for Davis?
yes, the 18,
Okay, yeah,
yes,
that's
sorry,
1860.
yes,
That's not in Cincinnati. Just
this,
so
yes,
you might want to edit that.
yes, the Sea
But
cities.
yeah,
So if you want
yeah,
to talk a little bit about that
yeah,
and his allegiance with the Democratic Party heading like
yeah.
into the war itself.
Yeah, one of the things that people sort of relentlessly remind me of, which I think is rather funny, as if I don't know, and I'm not talking about you here, but I can run down a litany of Butler's pro-union, pro-Black American, nationalist activities. And they'll tell me, yeah, but he voted for Jefferson Davis in 1860. Did you know that? And I think, well, yes, I knew that, but I'm not quite sure why, measured against this long list of other things he did. That's the thing that people remember. But it is true. He was, at the time that he went to the 1860 convention, he believed that the most important thing was trying to hold the nation together. He had no indication. He initially planned to vote for Stephen Douglas, or he at least told Stephen Douglas he would vote for him if he felt that Stephen Douglas could hold the party together and hold the nation together, which he quickly decided was not possible. And then he switched to voting for Jefferson Davis because he thought Davis was probably the best candidate. And of course, now we know Davis really was not a very good candidate for him to vote for, but there was no indication at that time that Davis was going to leave the United States and lead the Confederate States into war. So he made a judgment call. He was at that time pretty loyal to the Democratic Party, I would say, because it fit with his principles better than any other party, and because he was new at this business, and so it made sense to him. But over the course of the war, of course, he becomes much more like a radical Republican. For Lincoln, it was important, though, that Butler was a Democrat, I think, because Lincoln earnestly wanted the war not to be a partisan war between the Republicans and the Democrats, but he wanted Republicans and Democrats united in the North against this rebellion. And so to have some Democrats in leadership was very important. And I think that actually served Butler well in terms of him getting a political appointment, as did his good connections, his paramilitary experience, if you want to call it that. He didn't go to West Point, but he did have experience with the militia, and his very assertive nature to say, I'll do the job, I can do it, and so on. So he goes into the war as a Democrat. He didn't actually vote for Jefferson Davis, obviously. He didn't vote for Lincoln either. He voted for Breckinridge, apparently. But he goes into the war as a Union man, first and foremost, but a Democrat at that time, if he has any affiliation. But you're so right. I mean, it really, for him, it's practical politics, increasingly so over the course of his life. It's like, where do I see my principles most clearly being, manifested? I'll stick with them, which leads to many people saying he has no principles at all. And I would say that's just ridiculous.
Yeah, and I also think that, go ahead.
No, he would also say that's ridiculous. Obviously, my principles have been the same all along, and the parties keep changing. And for goodness sake, we know the parties change. I mean, the Republican Party today has very little resemblance to the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln. I mean, parties change, and he moved to where the party fit him best.
Right. And I think also his political affiliation, but as we'll get into, his strong role in the military, also prompted many people to say that some of his actions were political, or kind of driven by self desire to rise in politics.
It's just about ambition, right? It
Right,
has nothing
exactly.
to do with principle. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's
So
such a good way to dismiss somebody,
right.
especially if you don't like their principles. So then you just throw their principles aside and say, oh, well, it's just political. I mean, you hear that in Washington all the time today. Oh, it's just political. And I think it's just political. Everything is political. How are you using that as a slur? Of course it's political, because politics is about power and who has power and how do you use that power. So of course it's political, but that doesn't mean there's no principle behind it.
Right. So kind of moving a little bit away from politics now, as you said, everything's political, but on the more military side of Butler's life, Butler was involved in the Massachusetts State Militia, and military played a large role in his upbringing, getting rejected from West Point, but then, like I mentioned, joining the militia. And then one of the things Butler's most noted for is his command of New Orleans, in the early days of the war, through, I believe, 1962 or early 63. So if you 62, so did I say 1960?
You did.
Always mixing that. When I want to write 1962, I write 1862. I always mix them up. But so could you talk a little bit about his service in New Orleans and the criticism he received, and also kind of the praise that he received from both the people of Louisiana and the people of the North?
He was the commander of the Union forces in New Orleans for the bulk of 1862. And that is the source of many of the legends and pejorative nicknames that have followed him through his life, followed him beyond the grave, follow him today: Beast Butler, Spoons Butler, and so on. That's all tied to his very stern, relative to Confederates, leadership of the occupation in New Orleans. So he did things that incensed and infuriated Confederates in New Orleans, who were, by the way, ferociously rebellious. And more than one historian has said when Butler arrived in New Orleans in April of 1862, was basically anarchy, and we shouldn't forget that New Orleans is really one of the most important it's the most important early testing ground for Reconstruction and for Union needed not just to win battles, it needed to invade this rebellious territory and occupy it and suppress the rebellion. And that's what he was trying to do quite fiercely and sternly in New Orleans. And it ticked a lot of Confederates off, as if, how dare you? But after all, how dare they? They were in rebellion. So he was doing the job he thought he was called to do, and certainly getting a lot of praise for it from many people in the North, but even some Northerners and certainly many Confederates in the South, and certainly many foreigners were shocked by his what they perceived to be his overstepping relative to Confederate women, with his woman order, where he basically said, you keep, I'm paraphrasing, but you keep spitting on my soldiers and I'm throwing you in jail like a prostitute. And that made some people very upset, because how dare you impugn the virtue of Confederate women. He also executed somebody, William Mumford, who tore the flag down from the U.S. Mint, the U.S. flag, tore it down, dragged it through the streets, and he was court-martialed or had a military trial and was executed, and Butler oversaw that as well. He was very tough on the rebels in New Orleans, but he was also deeply compassionate and concerned about the poor in New Orleans, whom he believed had been profoundly misled and mistreated by the Confederate leadership. It's there that he first starts creating Black regiments. And we shouldn't, avoid talking about his other really important early in the war, some of his other early actions like the contraband policy, which happens the year before. But in any case, I mean, he did things. He was a very bold, very strong leader in New Orleans. And the price is some people love you and some people hate you. And that goes on through. And I will say that the even at Colby, when I was telling people before the book came out, I'm writing about Benjamin Butler, even people at Colby would say, who were lifelong Northerners, would say, "Oh, Beast Butler." And I thought, really, even here, that's what you think of when you think of Benjamin Butler. And I think that sort of Northern persistence of that harsh epithet is a tribute to the lost cause and its success in perpetuating a kind of narrative about the war that has little or nothing to do with what actually happened.
And so following Butler's command in New Orleans, he goes back to Lowell for a short period of time, and he is looking for some other type of appointment, either going into Lincoln's cabinet or getting another military assignment. And there's a lot of considerations behind the scenes as well about where Butler should go.
Right.
But this is where I think you start to see Butler's kind of evolution really come through on Black civil rights and equality, primarily because of his command of the Army of the James. So if you want to talk a little bit about kind of that transition back to civilian life and then back into the military and through the end of the war.
Yeah. Well, I do think his transformation begins at Fort Monroe in 1861, when he initiates the contraband policy, when those first 3 enslaved men come and ask for protection, and Butler, wily, clever, thoughtful, legal-minded Butler, works his way through to this idea of calling them contraband and refusing to return them to their owners. And that's where he really begins to encounter chattel slavery directly, and I think begins to be transformed by it. But between May of 1861 and then the end of 1863 and 1864, when he's with the Army of the James, there are, some ups and downs. There's New Orleans, where he takes these Louisiana Native Guards and turns them into Union troops. So there are Black soldiers there that he begins to work with and begins to appreciate as well. And then he works with the Army of the James. And I think after that time, with all these Black regiments in the Army of the James, there's just no way he could ever stop including Black Americans and perhaps putting them in the first rank of the people he considered the underdogs of society, to whom he would dedicate his time and energy to protect them and to enhance their opportunities, because he was so profoundly impressed by what enslaved people and Black Americans generally were willing to sacrifice for freedom and for the nation's agenda, without any guarantee that they would be successful or that they would benefit from their sacrifice in any way. And actually almost every likelihood that they would not, right? Almost every likelihood that they would be killed, imprisoned, their families would be killed, and so on. So he was really struck by that. And that launched him then on a post-war career of deep commitment to advancing the cause of people that he believed had done so very much for the Union victory. Again, with so little hope of success or benefit from it. So he really, he was really transformed by that experience.
And he has a bit of a falling out with Grant and Lincoln towards the end of his service. So if you want to briefly touch on that as well.
Yeah, he was. I've said to you in a number of settings, I'm not going to go toe to toe with the military historians and say, oh, he was a much better field commander than you. Like, that it's not my area of specialty. I have no reason to believe they're wrong when they say he was a bumbler in many cases. I do find it interesting that his stumbles are so much better remembered than his successes. And again, like, oh, yes, but he voted for Jefferson Davis. Yes, but he screwed up at Fort Fisher, or Dutch Gap. But he was what's the word? He was assertive. He was aggressive. He didn't always follow the order of rank. He didn't always act like a subordinate. He had very strong will. And I think he really was a challenge in that sense for both Lincoln and Grant to control. Plus, he wasn't brilliant in the field, although he was brilliant as an administrator. And I think it's important to remember that wars are not only won by the people who are shooting the guns. They are won by massive structures, financial and administrative, the home front. I mean, there are so many other things that go into a victory or a defeat. And he had a lot of strengths in other areas. But he didn't have certain strengths that maybe Grant and Lincoln needed at the end. And by the time they decide to release him from command, I think it's important that the election of 1864 is behind, because and Lincoln has won that election. So the fear of upsetting Butler supporters by firing him prior to that election is now gone, right? And now it's a little bit easier to let him go. So
and then yes, and then so the war ends in 1865, and shortly thereafter, President Lincoln is, of course, assassinated, and Andrew Johnson rises to power, and
worst ever until recently.
Yes. Well, I always think it's interesting because at first it was a somewhat pleasant reaction from people who had with the same viewpoint as Butler and the radical Republicans. And early on, Butler wanted to actually be a part of Johnson's cabinet and seek a post in that. But then, of course, quickly that spirals, and Butler wins a seat in Congress, in the House, and becomes the leading voice against Johnson. So if you want to talk a little bit about his election to the House and his leadership on the Johnson impeachment.
Butler you said it so nice. I mean, very quickly it spirals, as you said. By the end of May of 1865, 6 weeks after, Lincoln's assassination, Butler is already starting to give away the farm. And then he gives away more of the farm over the course of the summer back to white Southern leaders and so on. And then he's, forgiving everybody and pardoning everybody. And, things are really going to hell in a handbasket as far as people like Butler or Joseph Holt, whose biography I've also written, Lincoln's Judge Advocate General, people like that and the radicals are just pulling their hair out. They can't believe that the victory won with so much suffering and bloodshed and so much treasure expended is going to be just squandered, And so Butler sees Johnson as the biggest obstacle to what I like to say, sticking the landing of Union victory in a meaningful way, and particularly making that victory meaningful for the emancipated slaves, the freed people. And so he goes after him, and he goes after him early. He's not the first person to initiate the process of impeachment or to suggest articles of impeachment, but he does become the leading figure in practice, not actually in I think John Bingham was the head of the impeachment managers, but Butler is, the one that everybody assumes is leading the charge. Yeah, and it failed, which was kind of too bad. I used to say this awful thing. You might want to edit this out, but you don't have to, because I've said it in public before. There was a conspirator assigned to murder Johnson on the night that Lincoln was killed, and how different history might have been if he had not chickened out of his assignment and failed to accomplish it. That's not quite what I've said. I've said worse than that, but I'll leave it at that.
It's certainly a period where things could have gone a number of different ways, and it's remarkable to see exactly how things turned out, and how, like I mentioned at the start, how they're still impacting us today. So in addition to Johnson's impeachment and Butler's involvement in that, I think it's really important to focus on Butler's work on civil rights as a congressman as well, and primarily with focus on the Civil Rights Acts and the Reconstruction amendments.
Yes, and the anti-KKK acts. Right. He was so vigorous in pressing for the Civil Rights Act, in pressing for there to be some leverage on the part of the federal government against the KKK, or the rising, the resurgence of white supremacist violence, extraordinary violence, and so many other things. He was trying to desegregate West Point. It seemed like everywhere you turn he was a great advocate of the 14th Amendment, a great advocate of the 15th Amendment. He was pressing in every way he could as a congressman in the 10 years that he was in Congress. Unfortunately, the price of Reconstruction, political Reconstruction, if you mean by that bringing the states back in, the rebel states back into the Union, is that the Republicans, particularly the radicals, their power rapidly diminishes, because once you let those southern states back into the Union, they send Congress people to Washington who vote in a very different way. So the amount of time that's available for making the kind of significant changes that Butler and others hope for is very limited. But you said something in asking this question that I think is an important thing to remember, which is that I think you said something like, it's interesting to see what could have happened and then what actually did happen in Reconstruction. And I think, this is my theory, you can take it or leave it, but I think that one of the reasons Butler is sidelined and forgotten or misremembered in the way that he is, or boiled down to Beast Butler, or the guy who voted for Jefferson Davis 50 times or whatever, is because we struggle as a nation to face the fact that Reconstruction actually could have gone a different way. And there were voices that were calling for a different vision, and that were fighting for a different vision, that didn't believe that white brothers across the Mason-Dixon line should just clap each other on the back and say, oops, that was a bad family squabble, let's move on. There were voices saying we cannot allow the emancipated people to be thrown under the bus, the way that we're doing. We struggle as a nation to face that. It's much easier to think this is the way it had to be. This is just, this is the nature of things. But as in the case of so many historical moments, you can look back and actually find people that were saying, let's not do it this way. Let's do it this other way. And if they don't win, and then if they don't succeed, it's easier to erase them, especially if we feel bad about what happened when we shut them up. You know what I mean? And one of the people that I use as another example of this is Butler's son-in-law, Adelbert Ames, who was such an amazing person, such a loyal friend of his father-in-law, a Reconstruction governor in Mississippi who fought so hard to have Reconstruction mean something. And I want you to go write his biography. I want somebody to write his biography. It's not going to be me, but the fact that we don't have a good modern biography of Adelbert Ames, that's wrong. We should, but I think he's also sort of, yeah, well, nobody wants to hear what Adelbert Ames had to say and what he was fighting for, because it's just easier for us to think, yeah, well, had to go this way, But
Yeah,
Butler would say, no, it didn't, Could have gone
right.
another way if you'd listened to me. And if you'd listened to me now, he'd say, I'll come back from the dead and I'll tell you what to do now.
Yes, and I'm sure we would have some good results if we listened to his advice now as well. And I think it's an interesting, defense that people use of historical figures that they were products of their time, or that's just
Right.
how things were. And then you look at people like Butler and say, well, there were voices objecting them then
Yeah.
too. And I think that's really interesting in the kind of debate of history, and
When did
factoring
Henry
in
Wilson die? I don't know. When did he die? Henry Wilson.
75 in
Oh, okay. So
1875. Yes.
kind of like Thaddeus Stevens also
Yes.
died early. And so they can sort of, well, that's how it was when the radicals, but, then they had to be shoved aside, and this is the way it has to. Butler, shame on him, lived all the way to 1893, screaming for civil rights.
Yes. And so after Butler leaves, he remains in Congress and he makes some runs for the Massachusetts corner office as governor. And he finally does become governor. So if you want to kind of just give one summary of his short stint as the governor of Massachusetts and his legacy in that office.
Yeah. He had tried for a number of times, as you said, to become governor. And he did eventually in 1883 get elected. So he had that, or 1882, I guess he was governor for all of 1883. And Massachusetts elected a governor every year, I guess. Maybe that was true of Maine too. I should probably check. But anyway, he didn't have much time. But even in that short span of time, he did some interesting things. He named Clara Barton to a high position in his administration, or in Massachusetts institutional affairs. He went after the Tewksbury Almshouse for its really disgraceful treatment of its inmates. He named the first black judge in not just Massachusetts, but the United States. He was a controversial figure then. He had by then already, this is 1883, made a lot of enemies in Massachusetts, particularly among the wealthy Republicans in Massachusetts. So he had some enemies, and that kind of played out in his the way they went after him when he went to Harvard to be at the commencement ceremony that year, which was a traditional thing for governors to do. But, he had his year, and then that was kind of his last actual political office, because he did run for president afterwards, but did not even get the Democratic Party nomination. So that was the end of it. And he was ready to be done, I think, by then. I think also because he just really didn't know where his political home was anymore. Both major parties seem to be moving in the direction of hard money and who cares about the poor and who cares about blacks, and and the tiny parties that endorsed him, or the small parties that endorsed him, never had the power. And he was hoping to build a third party, actually a people's party, but didn't live long enough to see it.
Yeah, and I think an interesting side note that I've read about Butler is that he is credited as starting the lone walk tradition of the Massachusetts governor. At the end of the term, the governor walks down the steps of the front of the State House, and seeing that just a couple weeks ago when we inaugurated the new governor here in Massachusetts, seeing that happen and reflecting on Butler and his legacy. So kind of transitioning from that into what do you think is Butler's legacy on today? And as kind of an extra question, how do you think that the lost cause pushers of that movement affected Butler's legacy?
Well, I think Butler's legacy, it's because he's been so erased, you know, it's hard to say what is his legacy. If we decide to go back and actually get to know him and bring him back into the fold of American history, which is what I've tried to do, and popular consciousness, frankly, his legacy is to remind us that there's another way to go and that it doesn't hurt. You know, you may not succeed, but you might as well keep fighting for what you believe in, and that there have been people fighting for the kinds of issues we're still fighting for now. There have been some in the past that we can model ourselves on, that we can learn from, and who can be inspirations to us. He's a great inspiration to me for his dedication and his willingness. I mean, he was so bitterly attacked constantly, and yet he carried on. You know, he just carried on. So I think if we can bring him back into the fold, there's lots we can learn from him. And I think he has some good ideas for us. For example, I think he felt quite strongly, and I think I mentioned this in the introduction when I talk about Ibram Kendi, but I that he believed you can't just quickly change people's hearts and minds. You can't say, don't be a racist, and have that work. It might work sometimes, but you, meanwhile, better be passing laws, creating institutions that forbid racism and discrimination. And then people have to behave better. And as they behave better, because they're required to do so, their attitudes will change. If you desegregate West Point, eventually Black cadets and white cadets are going to be together. And the first few years might be tough, but eventually they're going to realize, oh, we're just people, you're as good a soldier as I am, etc. So I think that he has some things to teach us today about how to create change, and also about the things that, I guess I share a lot of his values, I in terms of like sticking up for the underdog, and standing side by side with them and valuing their contributions to our society. So, and the lost cause, I think, has been a major factor in repressing his memory and the memory of people like him, or turning it into some caricature of, some ugly caricature of ambition and greed, or failure, or whatever. And sadly, the lost cause has been very successful in many ways and bought into by, it's not just a Southern thing. It's something that many white Northerners for a long time have bought into. It's really hard to fight against it, even today, although it's getting better. The fact that this book is out there and people are reading it, it's a good thing, I think.
Certainly. And just bringing things back, it is the Henry Wilson podcast. So something that I've asked all of the researchers and historians that I've spoken to is, how often did Henry Wilson pop up in your research? How familiar were you with him? And how do you reflect on both Wilson and Butler as these somewhat unknown figures of the Civil War?
Yeah. Well, he popped up more in the pre-Civil War to Civil War phase for me, in terms of Butler and he seeming to cross paths and maybe even butt heads sometimes, but he wasn't a huge focus for me. I guess I was focusing on other things, and you're having done all this work on Wilson and bringing Butler into the story has really made me think I should have done more with Wilson, but there's a lot to have done that I did do. So I hope you'll forgive me for not being an expert on Wilson, but it sounds like his memory suffers from many of the same problems in terms of our cultural, erasure of a figure who actually could have helped us a lot.